Carol Rothman. Several months ago, when my younger son announced his engagement, he and his bride-to-be, who happens to be a pastry chef, asked if I would make their wedding cake. I wasn't surprised at the request, since I made the wedding cake for my other son, and you know what you do for one child, you have to do for the other. I, of course, wanted the cake to be beautiful, and in consultation with the bride, came up with a design that I think will work very well. If you've ever wondered about making a wedding cake at home, perhaps have been asked, perhaps you've done some decorating and were tempted, but felt it might be a daunting experience and weren't quite sure how you get everything done in time and how you stack the layers so that they don't collapse, I'm going to show you in this video just how this is accomplished. The first thing that the home baker has to think about is time. Anything that can possibly be done in advance should be done in advance so that the day or two before the wedding you have essentially the baking and the finishing touches to do. If you really press for time, you could make and freeze the layers, but I like to keep the cake part nice and fresh and make the inedible parts the work that I do in advance. Starting at the ground up, once we had decided on the configuration, the shape, the size of the layers, I was set to do the cake board. The home baker typically doesn't think about presentation. You put your cake on an attractive cake plate and that's it. Bakeries, however, and high-end cake decorators who specialize in major occasion cakes and charge thousands of dollars for them, take into consideration very carefully how the cake will be presented, since the cake board is actually as important as the cake in how it greets the eye. And in consultation with my future daughter-in-law, we decided that a cake board surrounded by ruffled satin would set off the cake nicely. The cake board was completed about a month ago. It's about 18 inches in diameter. The largest layer is 14 inches, which gives about the right amount of space on either side. Although this was not difficult to construct, the instructions are fairly specific, so I decided to make a separate video on making the cake board, which is called Making a Cake Board for a Wedding Cake. And that's posted on YouTube, so if you're interested in doing that, you can take your time with that to get started. Alright, that was the first part. That was done. Now, since their wedding is on the smaller side, but they wanted the full-size cake, and since I like creating permanent keepsakes for cakes, I decided to make the top two layers, a 6-inch layer and an 8-inch layer, out of styrofoam dummies. Now, a styrofoam dummy looks like this. It's made of various kinds of styrofoam. Sometimes it's solid, sometimes it's hollow, depending on the manufacturer. And that's what you see when you look in a bakery window and see those perma cakes that may live there sometimes long beyond their expected lifespan. They're practical in that if they're frosted the same way as the cake, and in this case with a fondant-covered cake, I use the same fondant that I'll be using to cover the cake, they match perfectly, which makes it very important to tell the caterer which layers are not to be cut into. And they can also be made so they'll lift off easily and will last for a very long time in an acrylic box. I started out with the decoration for the top layer. One of my specialties as a cake decorator was making small figures, and the bride requested that I make her in her wedding gown, with the groom dressed as he's going to be dressed. And since she's using purple orchids for her flowers, I needed to get or make purple orchids for the cake. The layer was completed about 2 weeks ago. When I'm working in the summer months, working with humidity, I do cakes well in advance. This time of year, which is early spring, the humidity is not a factor. Drying times are faster, but I still wanted to make sure it came out the way it would. I needed 2 takes on the groom, since after the first incarnation of the groom I discovered that his jacket was too short and that would never do. The bride, the base of it was the top of a styrofoam cone to get the right shape, and I copied her gown using dusting powders that glitter to give the touch of bling that's on the actual bodice. Copied their hairstyle. My son will be wearing a black tuxedo with a black vest. Copied their eye color and made them into little folk art figures. The bride wanted piping on the side of her cake, and this little dot piping, which is on the top layer, will be echoed 2 layers down. I used purple orchids, her color, and to save time and also for extra strength, I decided to buy rather than make the orchids, so that even if you don't have skills with gum paste flowers, you can avail yourself of the many beautiful flowers that are available. And if there's something that you like but is not quite the way you want it, you can unwire them, disassemble them, and then reassemble them to make it the way you want. I purchased sprays of purple orchids, and to make the top piece I used 3 of them, took them apart, rewired them. I also bought a box of what's called filler flowers, which can be used to fill in the spaces, as the name suggests. I used to make all of my flowers by hand, but the time constraints did not make that realistic. So I decided to purchase them, and I was very happy with the product. So this will be the very top layer. Now, if they needed more cake, the 8-inch layer under it would have been a regular 4-inch high cake layer. But since they didn't need it, I made that also out of a styrofoam dummy, covered with the same fondant I'll be using on the cake, and decorated, as the top layer was, with royal icing, but with a particular pattern. My son's fiancée selected the side decorations she liked from a photo that she saw, and I copied the idea of the pattern and made a template which I applied and used little pinholes to trace it out so that I could pipe over it with royal icing. When this was done, I dusted this layer and the other with the same iridescent dust that I had used for the bodice, although for the bodice I mixed it with vodka to make an iridescent paint, and for this I just dusted it, which actually covered my whole downstairs of my house with a sort of glittery coating. The stuff travels, but it's easy to apply and looks very nice. And what I'll do on cake day, once I've determined how this is going to sit, my plan is to make a hole in the underside. I had iced on a cake board to keep everything nice and clean. It will sit on top of a dowel, and then I'll add on the top layer and glue them together with the same royal icing that I used for the trim. Once I completed these 2 dummies and the cake board, my advance prep is done. Tomorrow will be baking day, and in anticipation of that, I'm preparing the ganache that I'm going to be using for some of the filling, and we'll whip up a batch of buttercream that I'll also need for crumb coating the cake, which is the layer that you give it underneath the fondant to hold everything together, and as the name suggests, to contain the crumbs. So I'm done for the day, and I'll resume early tomorrow morning. Last time the bakings, the cooling, the filling, and everything took a full 12 hours, so I'll probably be starting at 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning with the actual baking for the making of the cake itself.